10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Mrs. Speaker, I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today I'm so delighted to have Ken Jacobs with us of Smith and Jacobs. Ken specializes in all aspects of co-op and condominium life. For example, offering plans, corporate governance, fiduciary duty, alteration agreements, etc. His firm even gives seminars for new board members and not so new board members of all aspects of corporate governance. Recently, he and a few associates of his, for the benefit of the people who get the cooperator, spoke about a new statute that was passed by the New York State Senate. Kenneth, would you care to tell us about that new statute that was passed that affects co-ops and condominiums in New York State?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
All right, first, this not only passed the Senate, but it also passed the House, and it is awaiting the signature of the governor. So technically, it's not effective until the governor signs it. Well, let's talk about what the statute changed first, okay?
All right.
In 2019, the state passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. And what it did is impose innumerable restrictions on landlords. It applied to landlord-tenant relationships. And it prohibited a number of practices and directed a lot of others that affected all landlords and tenants. Well, co-op corporations are, in a co-op corporation, you get shares of stock and you also get a lease. The lease could be 99 years long. It's called a proprietary lease or an occupancy agreement, but it's still a lease. And the Tenant Protection Act affected co-ops as well as typical for-profit landlords. Co-ops objected to this because they're not for-profit entities. When you think about it, you pay your rent on a break-even basis. The co-op corporation doesn't make a profit like a typical landlord. So there were a number of provisions in the Tenant Protection Act that really hurt co-ops and impeded their ability to operate. This new statute that was just passed eliminates and modifies some of these damaging changes. So I'm going to go through some of the highlights of those now. Okay.
So, in other words, if they had not changed certain things, they would have had to raise the maintenance, so to speak.
Right.
But since these things that you're talking about are not don't occur on a monthly basis, shall we say, it was difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you can see some of the examples. And one caveat: these changes do not affect limited dividend housing, not like Mitchell Llamas and limited dividend companies, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The Housing Stability Act, all of the provisions of the Housing Stability Act continue to apply to limited equity co-ops. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so we're only talking about private co-ops here. Okay, so for example, the Housing Stability Act limited security deposits to 1 month's rent. All right. That sounds reasonable for a typical rental building, but in a co-op, a lot of times, the co-op corporation would be concerned about the ability of the purchasing shareholder to pay maintenance over a period of time. Maybe their finances were marginal. And so in order to deal with that, the co-op corporation would ask for an escrow deposit, let's say a year's worth of maintenance. And they would either draw on that escrow deposit during the year, or they'd keep it for a period of time, let's say 2 years. And if you've paid maintenance on a regular basis for 2 years, then they'd give you back your escrow. All right? The problem is that the way the Housing Stability Act was written, that escrow deposit was considered a security deposit, which was prohibited. So co-op corporations could no longer consider the marginal financial applicants with an escrow deposit. They were faced with either turning them down up front or accepting them and accepting the risk. Remember, unlike a landlord, if somebody doesn't pay his maintenance charges to the co-op corporation, everybody else has to pay it.
Right. And what's really problematic is the person comes in, seems very stable, and then he destabilizes.
Right.
And you don't have a security deposit, and he's already a shareholder. And what do you do then?
Then you have to start. Then you have to evict the shareholder for not paying the rent. And again, the costs of doing this, there are legal fees, there are filing fees, there are innumerable ways that the shareholder, the tenant, can game the system to gain more time. The Housing Stability Act limited the amount of money that a landlord could recover in connection with a summary proceeding, with an eviction proceeding.
Oh.
Okay, so for example, they could only collect rent in an eviction proceeding. So if you had late charges, you had legal fees, you had interest, none of that could be collected under the Housing Stability Act. Now again, for a for-profit landlord, it's a difficult business decision at that point. They have to absorb those. But for a co-op corporation, if the defaulting shareholder, if the defaulting tenant doesn't pay it, who does? The other shareholders. So let's just take those two examples, because those were two things that were changed in the statute. Escrow deposits are now allowed to be collected, provided that the shareholder is going to be residing in the apartment. So if you have a shareholder who is intending to actually occupy the unit, the co-op corporation can now collect an escrow deposit of more than 1 month's maintenance charges if it wants to test the shareholder's ability to make the payments on time. Okay. Before, you could only collect 1 month. Now they can go back to the way they had traditionally practiced it. We in the industry developed a workaround to this anyway, but I'm not going to get into that now. Okay. As far as collecting legal fees is concerned, now a co-op corporation is allowed to collect its legal fees in a summary proceeding, in an eviction proceeding. It doesn't have to start a new proceeding in order to collect its rent, in order to collect these additional charges. Let me just give you an example. Let's say a tenant shareholder hasn't paid a year's worth of maintenance, all right? And so you have interest that's accrued. So let's say they had $1,000 a month maintenance charges, all right? So the interest is $250 that's accrued during the year. And the legal fees, and the tenant shows up the first time and says, I don't have a lawyer. Then he shows up the second time and he says, I have a lawyer, but I don't like him. And so there's 3 or 4 court appearances, and let's say the legal fees are $1,500, all right? And then let's say the co-op corporation has a late charge, and I will get into that a little later, of $150 a piece, all right, a month. So that's another $1,200. Well, that adds up to about almost $3,000. Well, that sounds like a lot of money, but if you can't collect that in your eviction proceeding, and you have to start a whole new separate proceeding for which you won't be reimbursed to collect $3,000, the co-op corporation, it makes no financial sense for the co-op corporation to try to collect that. Well, and so who bears the cost of that? The other shareholders. With this change in the statute now, you can collect that interest, the legal fees, and possibly even the late charges, and I'll get to that. So now you can collect that as part of the eviction proceeding, which means that the other shareholders don't have to pay. Okay, I keep mentioning late charges.
Yes.
Maybe, all right. Under the Housing Stability Act, you couldn't charge late charges of more than a nominal amount. All right. That provides no incentive. If I can only charge $20 or $50 as a late charge, and my maintenance charges are $1,500 a month, that's not really much of a late charge. And so the co-op corporation was looking for some kind of incentive to persuade the defaulting shareholder to pay without commencing a legal proceeding, right? You don't want to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. So if the shareholder says, look, I can't pay now, but I'll go into a payment, give me 3 months, I'll pay the late charges, and the late charges are sufficient, then that might be a better incentive. So, but the legislature decided that they would allow up to an 8% late charge for each overdue installment.
Okay, each overdue installment.
Right. So you can't.
In other words, per month.
Per month, exactly.
Mhm.
So, now that sounds like a lot of money. 8% per month. That's potentially 96% per year. It's usurious. Well, late charges aren't interest. So, but nevertheless, if you have a $1,500 a month maintenance charge or a $1,000 a month maintenance charge, 8% is only $80 for 1,000, or $120 for $1,500. Again, you'd have to decide whether that really is an incentive to have a shareholder pay. More important, your lease has to authorize the payment of late charges. And it's for better or for worse, a lot of proprietary leases, a lot of leases in co-op corporations do not authorize the collection of late charges. They may call for the payment of interest at the maximum legal rate, which is 16% right now per year, okay? But they won't say that the co-op can charge a late fee. Now that doesn't prevent a lot of co-ops from charging a late fee, but what ends up happening is if you end up going to court and the shareholder says, wait a minute, they're not authorized to charge this, the court will knock out the late fees. But still, it functions as an incentive. So now, under the change in the law, co-op corporations can charge up to 8% per month on the overdue amount as a late charge,
Whether it's in the proprietary lease or not.
provided it's authorized under the proprietary lease.
Mhm.
So that's so what we've been recommending to our co-op corporations is, hey, it's not authorized under your proprietary lease. Let's use the change in the law as a reason to propose this to the shareholders to amend the proprietary lease. Now, I don't want to digress, but frequently you need at least a vote of 2/3 of all the shareholders to approve an amendment to the proprietary lease. So that's a huge obstacle. So what co-ops do is they sort of gather all the amendments they think they need, and they present them to the shareholders all at once as sort of an all-or-nothing package. And hopefully the shareholders will adopt all those amendments at once. Late charges are pretty important as an amendment, so we recommend that a co-op use this as an excuse to bring it before the shareholders. Okay, so we have escrow deposits are now permitted. You're allowed to collect legal fees in eviction proceedings. You're allowed to charge late charges. Another change, the Housing Stability Act prohibited managing agents and co-op corporations from charging application fees. Well, that might be one thing for a landlord doing a background check on a rental tenant. I mean, how detailed an analysis do you want to do? But in a co-op corporation, you're joining a community of shareholders. You're joining a community of other tenants who are counting on you to pay your share of the maintenance charges. So they do a more exhaustive check of your background. They may interview you to verify that, to ask you questions that come up in your application, or to verify that what you're saying you really mean? Or they might ask you, are you planning on doing major alterations? Did you forget to put down a pet? Anyway, the point is they
and
interview.
you lie.
Yeah, well, it's true, but don't forget your neighbors are your bosses, so to speak. So anyway, the point is, it takes work to prepare these applications, review these applications, process them, do the background checks, etc. So most managing agents charge a fee for doing this.
Yes.
Most co-op corporations do not charge a separate application fee. A lot of managing agents thought now they were violating the law if they charged a $350 or $400 or $500 application fee to prospective tenant shareholders to process the application. It was a real problem for management. And again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I should explain for the benefit of managing agents why it's a problem for them, okay? Most co-op corporations, they think, okay, my managing agent's charging me $40,000 a year, and that's all he's charging. But that's not true, because the managing agent has to, usually the total fees that a managing agent have are more like total costs to the managing agent, are more like $50,000 or $60,000. They're over and above the amount that you pay, and the managing agent counts on collecting a certain amount of fees from people who are applying to become purchasers or are looking to make alterations. In other words, extra work that the managing agent does, and they count on those fees to make up their total management package. So to the extent that they were prohibited from collecting any processing fees, any application fees, they would have to raise their charges to the co-op corporation. So everybody else pays more rent, more maintenance charges. Okay. The new statute allows managing agents to charge an application fee. So that burden on all the other shareholders is now eliminated. You can go back to, managing agents can go back to the way it was.
We're basically charging on a case-by-case basis rather than
Right.
a monthly basis.
Rather,
Or
right,
increase
rather than
monthly.
adding up what they think it was going to be and then increasing their management fee. There was a lot of pressure on managing agents, and for better or for worse, managing agents are the unsung heroes around here. They make sure the building runs. So that's my shout out to managing agents today.
When maintenance goes up, do any of the shareholders have to be notified in advance?
That's a good question. All right. Another change to the Housing Stability Act was that if the maintenance was going to go up by more than, I believe, 3%, it's either 3 or 5%, the landlord had to notify the tenants in advance and let them know your rent's going up and explain to them why. Most co-ops don't operate that way. Most co-ops elect a board of directors. The board of directors, it's comprised of tenant shareholders. They do a lot of work, and they pay the same rent that everybody else is paying. So they do a lot of work to see how much is it going to cost us to operate the building. And after doing that work, then they will let the shareholders know how much maintenance is going up. Now, frequently, they'd have a meeting to discuss. They discuss on an informational basis with shareholders why maintenance is going up. That usually comes up at the annual meeting. And they'll talk about how real estate taxes have gone up, how wages have gone up, how insurance costs have gone up, and as a result, we have to increase maintenance to cover that. And they talk about it with the shareholders, but they don't have to ask shareholders permission, and they don't need to let shareholders know in advance. Remember, your board is volunteers. They are not the landlord. They don't make a profit from raising maintenance. And every hour, and they don't get compensated. At annual meetings, I always make a motion to triple the compensation of the board members. And all the shareholders look around and go, what? And so then I explain that's 0 times 3. So this relieves boards of the obligation to notify shareholders in advance that maintenance charges are going up, or they can't charge the increase. they don't charge the increase, the building isn't operating on a break-even basis. So they'll have to charge more later. It doesn't help anybody.
So one way or the other, a tenant will have, a shareholder will have to decide whether he can afford to stay there or not,
Right, right.
either before or after.
And he can elect the board. I mean, if he doesn't like it, he can choose a new board member. But look, board members try hard.
Yeah.
And the second least appreciated person, aside from the managing agent, is the board president. Because when the light bulb goes out in the ceiling, who gets the call? The board president.
Don't call me, call the managing agent.
Yeah, call, right. That's what they try to say. And the managing agent won't talk with me. Well, it's because you're calling them up about the light bulb. Yes. I mean,
Well, the super.
yeah. So those were some of the major changes
Yes.
in the Tenant Protection Act, and they're going to help. There was another change. It wasn't in this statute. It was in another law that got passed at the state level, and it related to getting the co-op condo tax abatement. Now, if you're a co-op shareholder in New York, you may know about the co-op condo tax abatement. It was established because single-family homeowners in New York are taxed at a much lower rate than co-op shareholders in New York, because the way New York calculates real estate taxes, co-ops are considered like rental buildings. So what the city does is it says, what would your income be if you were a rental building as opposed to a break-even co-op? And then the city charges your real estate taxes based on what the income level was, as if you were a for-profit landlord. So co-ops are getting charged through the nose. In order to equalize that, the city decided to give an abatement to co-op shareholders. It's usually around 19 or 20% per year. Still doesn't make it even, but nevertheless, it's a big help. Now, 2 points on this. First of all, I know if anybody in the audience who lives outside of New York, it's actually the opposite outside of New York. In other words, single-family homeowners are assessed, they pay taxes at a much higher rate than co-ops do. So they're frustrated. So hold your ears if you live outside of New York City. Okay, but if you're so that's one point. The other thing is, you may not realize that you're getting this co-op condo tax abatement, because frequently what the board of directors does is the money gets returned not to the individual shareholder, it gets returned to the board of directors. And the board of directors uses this money to build up the reserve fund in the co-op. So what it does is it passes an assessment equal to the amount of money that the shareholder would be entitled to get back. And lo and behold, they have that money in hand already, so they credit you for the amount of the assessment.
Provided you actually live in the apartment.
Provided you actually live in the apartment. Okay, see, I have to be very specific with you. Yes, provided you actually live in the apartment. So investors don't get the benefit. They have to pay the assessment. Sponsors have to pay the assessment. And they're not too happy about it. But nevertheless, it's a way to build it's a way to build up the working capital reserve fund, and it's useful. Anyway, co-op condo tax abatement. What the city did is they extended it, all right? But they imposed a few limitations. If your co-op has 30 or fewer units, then you're just going to get the abatement as you did before. If your co-op has 100 or more units, then you have to meet another criterion. Your co-op building has to pay its workers the prevailing wage. Prevailing wage is established by the controller of the city of New York. It's not union wages, but it's a lot closer to union wages than non-union wages. So they want to make sure that if your co-op has 100 or more apartments in it, that you're paying your workers.
I see there's a gap between 30 and 100.
Okay, well, yes, if you're between 30 and 100, then if the assessed value of your co-op, actually this applies to condos too, but if you assess value of the co-op units averages $60,000 or less, then you get the co-op condo tax abatement. If it's more than 60,000, then you have to pay your workers the prevailing wage in order to qualify for the co-op condo tax abatement. So I think that's way too complex for me to be talking about. It's a lot better if you put it in a spreadsheet, or a table. But basically,
I'm saying to myself, what, are they talking about the value of apartments today, or are they talking about the value of apartments 20 years ago?
they're talking about assessed value first of all.
Okay.
Okay. So, and what's ironic about this is if you live in a condo, if you live in a co-op, you can go onto the Department of Finance website. You can look up the assessed value of the building. You know the number of units in the building. You divide it, and there you get your average value per unit. You don't have that benefit if you're a condo owner. In a condo, you literally have to check every unit, see what the assessed value of that unit is, add it up in the building, and then you divide it by the number of units in total. It's a real pain. There are a couple of back channel ways you can get this, but it's not nearly as easy for a condo as it is for a co-op. But look, bottom line is, it's not, you don't just get the co-op condo tax abatement anymore. If your building has 100 or more units, make sure they pay your staff adequately in order for you to get it. So that's another change. That's another law that was changed this year. Okay.
What puzzled me, the statute mentioned occupancy agreement in a summary proceeding. Why did it just say proprietary lease?
Good question. Because a lot of co-ops, limited equity co-ops especially, or some of the older HDFCs, Housing Development Fund Corporation, they call the proprietary lease the occupancy agreement.
Oh.
But they're really the same. The contents may be a little different, but the length of time and the intent is the same. If you own shares of stock, you're entitled to get an occupancy agreement or a proprietary lease. One other thing, these exemptions only apply to co-op and tenant shareholder, okay? If you are a tenant shareholder or a condo unit owner and you are subleasing your apartment, or in a case of a condo leasing your apartment, you're still governed by the Housing Stability Act. These exemptions that apply to co-op corporations do not apply to individual tenants and condo unit owners, or tenant shareholders and condo unit owners who are subleasing. So please, consult a lawyer. There are a lot of nuances in the Housing Stability Act that you might fall victim to if you're not careful.
To clarify that, it means if you are a tenant rather than a shareholder, you fall under the Tenant Protection Stability Act.
Right. If you're a
Not
subtenant in a co-op, or a tenant in a condo, or a tenant in a regular building, yes, you're still, the Housing Stability Act still applies 100% to you.
i.e., you're a renter.
You're a renter. You're a renter. Okay. You caught me. Okay. There are some other changes that were put out, but they're not directly related to the Housing Stability Act.
Okay.
But they're changes in the law.
Mhm.
And they may be changes in local law. They're changes in local law and not necessarily state law. So, lead paint. Effective August 9th. There are more stringent lead paint investigation requirements that are imposed on co-ops and condos now. A different type of a certain type of test that we always have to do beginning this year, called the XRF test. And please, I think it's X-ray fluorescence
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's a different type of test. It's not just scraping like this, but you have to actually use an instrument in order to check to see whether there's lead paint. And more important, it broadens the definition of what is a surface that needs to be protected against lead paint. Basically, any chewable surface. So think about what your baby might reach.
Anything.
Just about anything, right? And that's a chewable surface, and that's what you're going to have to. That's what you're going to have to make sure gets protected against lead paint
Well, I can
hazards.
find one procedure for protecting against lead paint was to cover it with fiberglass or some other covering. But if you're using a, what's this,
It's X-ray fluorescence, right?
X-ray fluorescent, that penetrates the covering.
Yeah. You have to use a certain type of very thick paint. That's what most people do. They encapsulate it. They
You have to encapsulate.
you don't remove it. Yeah. You can, if you use this very thick type of paint, that will usually protect you.
You're
Now,
talking about enamel, I presume.
no, more than enamel.
More than
It's-
enamel.
Yeah. I wish I could tell you the name of that lead paint.
So
but-
basically,
but it's
coating
there.
with fiberglass or something like that is insufficient.
Well,
Or
it's
will cover.
fiberglass is impractical. If you have to, I mean, it's so hard to mold fiberglass around a banister.
Okay.
Okay, and bear in mind that it has to be, it's a resident child, and child to be under 9 years old. You have to
Under
watch
medicine,
out for it.
oh God.
And the problem for co-ops, and the reason I mention this is that if the burden of enforcement of this, the burden of making sure this is done, falls on the co-op corporation if the shareholder doesn't send in a question. The co-op corporation is going to send out a questionnaire every year, all right?
Right.
A lot of shareholders don't return the questionnaires. And the burden now falls on the co-op corporation to make sure that the shareholder returns the questionnaire, and to make sure that if it's a non-resident shareholder, that they are making sure that their subtenants got the questionnaire. So it's a big pain. One managing agent said to me, "I just tell my co-ops don't allow subleasing, because now all of a sudden you're the responsible party to make sure this non-resident shareholder has sent out the questionnaire to his subtenant."
Oh, but my baby just chewed your banister outside the apartment.
or the subtenant calls in the Department of Housing Preservation and Development.
Yeah.
So they come in, they do the work of removing the lead paint, which could cost $30,000, all right? And who gets the bill? Well, initially, the co-op corporation gets the bill because they own the building, all right? Yes, they pass it on to the shareholder. Listen to how much extra work this is. And what does the board say? Board tells the managing agent, go ahead. And again, my shout out to the managing agents. I have your back. All these questionnaires, et cetera, the managing agents have to do. Managing agents have started to charge for this. And that's okay. So that's another complication. Now, if it's a condo, the unit owner in the condo is generally responsible for this. But again, co-ops are landlords, and even though you might think a co-op landlord and a condo unit owner are the same, the state and the city don't treat them the same way. They consider condos a bunch of neighbors getting together and sharing the responsibility, as opposed to a co-op being a landlord, a nasty landlord who is trying to extract the most maintenance charges from its tenant shareholders. Just not the case.
Well, it sounds like a real conundrum, a real swamp.
Well, this is now my point. The point I say, consult your lawyer. Okay? Yes, it costs money, but this is your biggest investment. And I say, do what needs to be done to protect your investment.
Now, Ken, what would you most like our audience to take away with them?
Well, I'm going to repeat what I just said, okay? First of all, the co-op condo lawyer. The co-op lawyer is not like TV. Okay? We're there as a resource. We're there to help you protect your investment. Don't be afraid to consult with your lawyer to keep up with these changes. The managing agent doesn't wear a big red S on his chest. He can't be the repository of all knowledge. Your board are volunteers. They also can't be responsible for everything. Use everybody who you have as a resource to help keep your building running smoothly. And the second thing is you need to be prepared for more regulation, more complications, because tenants, renters, children, they all need to be protected, and the city is focusing on that, and so is the state. But basically, it's important to let people know that a co-op is not the same as a for-profit rental building. And make sure your representatives know that, make sure your community board knows that, and make sure that your building is running smoothly.
Ken, I want to thank you so much for having come on our show. Until next time, this is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.